Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I am delighted to welcome an accomplished professional from Oakland, California, in USA, Mr. Chris Butler. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to chat.
Chris is the Staff Product Operations Manager of GitHub. He's also the co-founder of the Uncertainty Project. Chris focuses on bias, uncertainty, and randomization to help build more robust and resilient teams. So, Chris, before we get into a discussion on building resilient teams, tell me about your own journey in brief.
Absolutely. Well, I guess I've almost had like a couple career changes before I even got started with my career. Very early on, I was an apprentice to my dad's work, who was an art director doing print ads. And so I was helping him move over from kind of the idea of, X-Acto knives, spray adhesive, like typesetting, things like that, into actually the world of digital production. And so not only was I helping him move a lot of his layout over to things like Quark Express and Illustrator, but also just like starting to sell web pages to people in the mid 90s that were his advertising clients. And so my original thinking was that I would go to art school in some way. During high school, I did a lot of stuff around computer programming and electronics, even dabbled in kind of both phone and computer stuff that I would say is kind of gray hat hacker types of things. Right. And then ended up actually going to Boston University rather than art school to be able to study engineering. And so from there, I ended up doing a computer systems engineering degree and tried to actually double major in physics, but just couldn't deal with the math at the higher graduate levels around that. And so I really loved the idea of being an engineer and building interesting kind of both devices and software. But when I ended up interviewing for a bunch of different places, I got job offers from places like Motorola, General Dynamics, that type of stuff, MITRE. I ended up interviewing at Microsoft as a program manager. And from there, I guess the questions like, how do you design a washer-dryer combination for the sight impaired is a really interesting question. It actually gets at like, how do we make people's lives better? And I guess I realized that I was never going to be the best developer or engineer in the world, and felt like asking really interesting questions and really trying to understand people was more interesting to me. Since then, I've worked a lot of different places. Probably would have heard of, would have been like Microsoft, Waze, Kayak, Facebook Reality Labs, Cognizant, Google, and then now I'm at GitHub. And so I've always kind of been on the edge of like whenever we're trying to understand some type of new paradigm, like going from boxed software to web or web to mobile, or now even the adoption of AI and ML. And so I'm always just thinking about like, what are the heuristics or rules or the ways to adopt this technology for people is really the top of mind for me. And I'm also a Maven instructor, a sci-fi writer. I do a lot of role-playing games. And then I've also kind of been doing a lot of facilitation. We just had a really interesting summit with the Near Future Laboratory called Imagine Harder, where we use things like design fiction to consider the future. So I guess I do a lot of different stuff. Yeah, is the way to think about it.
Thank you. That's quite an amazing journey. But then what got you interested in bias, uncertainty, and randomization? And how would you define bias in the context of AI product management?
Yeah, I think that what I started to see was that there's a lot of people that I'd be around in teams where they were very smart, right? And usually those smart people are very certain about the way that they deal with things. But after spending a couple years as a design consultant, we would go in and there would be this assumption that these people were just correct about everything that they had, and they just needed someone to go and execute and build the thing. But whenever we do some kind of testing, user research, prototyping, and we went and actually talked to the people that they were trying to build for, we'd find that they had a lot of assumptions or a lot of biases in the way that they thought about their customers, about the problem, about the value that they could create. And so doing that type of user research kind of opened my eyes to all of these different things, not only about how do we learn more about what people actually need or want, but also this idea of like, how do we now kind of, I guess, use our own teams and ideation methods, facilitation methods to actually do a better job in some way of making decisions. And so I guess when we talk about bias, what I really see as bias, there's one side of it, which is we make decisions in a way that is not always in our best kind of logical or reasoned benefit. And so this is where like economics and a lot of economic kind of theories come together to say that this idea of a rational decision maker ends up maximizing certain types of returns. The problem is that human beings are not in a place where they can always maximize their returns. They have little time, they have little information, they have little resources. And so they're constantly trying to kind of like figure out how to take advantage of those things. And so even the idea of, say, making a decision where we optimize for today versus the future is a very natural one because we don't know what the future will be. The future could be incredibly uncertain. Right. And so that bias of kind of taking the money now versus later, that type of question, it's not fair, I think, to say that people are making the wrong decision because they're actually optimizing for having money now, which they can invest or use in some way. But I think there's also the other side, which is, I think a lot of groups end up suffering from different types of biases, mostly because of power structures, because of the way that people talk to each other, and things like that. And so I guess I look at biases as these are, I guess, kind of a combination of hardware and software that's been developed over millions of years for human beings to make better decisions. But it doesn't mean that we can't now also evolve with this like higher level order of thinking to be able to make even better decisions. And so that's a lot of what I think about is just how do we break out of these both individual and group biases that we may find ourselves in.
Well said. And a follow-up question, Chris, would be that what have you seen as some of the common biases that impact cross-team alignment when building AI products?
Yeah, I mean, I think like one of them is that we end up thinking too much from a technical standpoint rather than a user-centric one. And so a lot of the time I'll get questions from PMs that are like, how do I become an AI PM? Which, by the way, I'm not exactly sure that AI PM is an actually thing long-term. I think once that this just becomes another technology, we don't have like mobile PMs or web PMs as much as we used to, right? Like that might still be some terminology that people use, but it's more so that we can set that expectations of what are the characteristics of the technology that we need to leverage. And so I would just say that generally there's this pull from kind of engineers, researchers, and people that are actually building these highly technical systems to pull PMs in the direction of being more technical. And I would argue that's actually bad. Because what we want is we want a really healthy tension between people that are very user or customer centric, and we want people that are very technology trade-off driven.
Yeah.
And the conversations that take place between those people is actually really, really important. So I think that's one bias, is that we assume that because something is a brand new technology, that we have to be really technical about the technology rather than just like thinking about how does this technology apply to the use cases that we already have. And maybe the best example of that was I was at Kayak when we were making this transition from web to mobile. As like a predominant way that people interacted with the Kayak brand. And at that place, like I had a very weird title because it had like mobile in the title because we were really specifically about that. But it was more about like once people have more access to travel information when they're just like walking around, how does that change their usage patterns? And does that change their travel patterns at all? And what we found is it does change their usage patterns, right? People look up travel more because they're just hanging out with their friends or they're like, oh, how much would it cost for all of us to go somewhere? But they don't buy more travel necessarily because they don't have more days off. They don't make more money just because they have a mobile phone, right? And so I think we end up learning that the characteristics of this technology are more about access as a channel anywhere I am, which is really valuable in some ways, but probably goes more the path that like when I'm bored, I can now go on TikTok or something else to look at that, or LinkedIn or whatever it is that people end up using. So I'd say that's the biggest thing, is just thinking that new technologies require you to be very, very technical, I think is the bias that we see a lot of the time.
Well said. And Chris, what inspired you to develop techniques like empathy mapping for the machine and confusion mapping?
Yeah, there's been maybe another one too called analogous innovation that's more recent. But I would say that generally my conversations or the things that I try to do in my work is actually create containers or spaces for people that are technical, right? Engineers, researchers, people that maybe even are highly skilled in a very particular practice, like legal even, or privacy, right? And try to bring those types of highly technical conversations into the realm of non-technical people. And so empathy mapping for the machine is doing a little bit of personification of the system that we're trying to build, so that we can then start to talk about what is it that the non-technical people, which are lots of different types of people, product managers, designers, user researchers, even the customers themselves,
Right.
right? They can then have this conversation in a way that is more about like, what do I expect from a human that would be doing this job? So that then the highly technical people that are maybe doing research and development around new model types, or the engineers that are actually building the systems, they can actually understand at a much deeper level, what are we trying to do with this technology, and what trade-offs are actually acceptable?
Right.
Because like I said, we don't have unlimited time and unlimited resources. We have to make do with what we have usually. And so what are the trade-offs we're willing to make in that case? So that's what I'd say is those techniques are really about that idea of how are we creating a way for technical and non-technical people to have better conversations? And that's really where it comes from.
Well said. And how do you help teams navigate the challenges of ambiguity when there
Yeah.
is no clear path forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where randomness comes in a little bit. Like, I think a lot of the time we believe that we're able to have an understanding that allows us to make the perfect decision when, because of the fact that there's uncertainty about the future, there's ambiguity about what is right or wrong or best, right? Or worst. I found that actually exploring the future of space using things like randomness, I think also there's various speculative practices like design fiction or scenario planning, or even wargaming, and those types of things allow you to actually explore the space of the possible future. And that to me is much more valuable than just saying that we know right now, and so we have to go do this thing. Randomness is interesting because I think it kind of pokes at what are your true assumptions about the world. Because when you, for example, I have all these like card decks of different types, and I'm right now, I try triggers. This one's the user-centric. They renamed it the human-centric deck. I actually wrote the machine learning deck for them. But these are like 60 questions that you should ask if you're building a user experience. Or the machine learning deck is like, these are 60 questions you should be asking about machine learning projects, right? But you don't have time for every decision you're making to ask all 60 of those questions. But if I draw like 3, 4, 5 of these questions here, I've made my decision-making practice even better in that case. And so there is a lot of ambiguity in the world, but I would say that really great questions end up helping reduce that ambiguity maybe a little bit, or at least make you understand what you really care about. Maybe a good example of that is if you're finding that a team is having some type of like analysis paralysis to make a decision. When you take a coin, like say you say, okay, well, we're just going to flip a coin for these two options. When the coin is in the air, almost everybody, before they understand what the coin flip was, they know exactly what they really think is best in that decision, right? Because there's like an innate there's an intuition based on all of our tacit knowledge on what is the right choice here. And if we are having that type of struggle, there's, human intuition is really valuable. And so I think we should be utilizing those types of things more often than we do. Even in the idea of like data-driven is meant to kind of like sway your intuition because it gives you markers for what the naturalistic decision-making community, they would call kind of like experience prototypes. And so what we're trying to do is, what are the triggers or the kind of the signals in the world that we're discerning to be able to use our intuition to then make a better decision in a lot of ways. And that's where data, I think, and the idea of like data-driven decision-making is really about driving that intuition for us. So that's what I'd say is like, I don't think it's bad that there is uncertainty or ambiguity. If anything, we should be using it to our advantage when we're building things. But what it means is that sometimes we leave a decision till the last possible responsible moment because we have more information at that point. But then there's other times where we have to make bets. And that's where I think de-risking or lowering the cost of making a decision is always valuable. And that means sometimes doing experiments, right? Or prototyping something, or doing user research, or even just like asking these 5 random questions ends up getting you into a better mind state. And I think there's some interesting things like even using things like AI tools now. Sometimes these questions can be too generic, but you can actually ask, there's a deck of cards called Oblique Strategies, which is by Brian Eno and is pretty well known within some like design communities. But I would ask, say ChatGPT or Claude or something like that, give me 20 questions that are in this domain that are in the style of Oblique Strategies. And you again get these kind of like it's meant to cause enough confusion for people to be creative is really what we're looking for here.
Yeah.
And so that's, I guess,
Sure.
my practice is a lot about just trying to like push teams to think a bit more outside of what they would usually
Absolutely.
consider.
And then it's an amazing role to have, but it also tells me how deep your own knowledge has to be able to push these teams. But Chris, my
Yeah.
next question is, can you talk a little bit about the relationship between psychological safety
Hmm.
and a team's ability to embrace uncertainty and randomness? And this is especially in the context as human beings, we all like status quo.
Yeah. Yeah, we do. And I would say that there's some teams, right? I'd say there's like kind of like there's a team that is not psychologically safe and how they deal with uncertainty, and then there's the psychologically safe one. And I think the one that is not psychologically safe, the one where it's a lot about survivorship bias. So even if you're making decisions in the best way possible, they're really being outcome focused rather than decision process focused. And so what that means is that, even though maybe 50% of your decision making process was based on just some uncertainty in the world, if you're right, you are successful. And in my opinion, that's a bad place to be, because that means that that type of decision making process is not, I guess, repeatable as
Mhm.
much. And it gets harder. And what you end up doing is actually churning through a lot of people
Right.
until you find someone that was lucky enough to survive every round,
Mhm.
right? And that gets less and like. It's like the idea of like rolling a six every single time with the dice
Right.
for 100 times.
Mhm.
Sure, some people will do that, but it's very rare. I
Correct.
think the psychological safe version of this, or the one where it's less about power structures and about being perfect, but it's about, one, are we constantly trying to adjust the way we look at information in the world to make a decision?
Mhm.
How do we make those decisions as great as possible? And that sometimes means, like, one of the things I've found inside of organizations is that they end up kind of mixing the discourse and discussion around decisions with the decision itself. And so that means that you have like millions of meetings where you're constantly trying to make a decision, but you can't because there's
Mhm.
more discussion that needs to take place. But when you separate those two things out, you end up creating space for the discussion to take place the way it should, which is we're
Right.
just going to gather options, refine them,
Mhm.
and then we're going to make the person who is supposed to make this decision, which is usually ideally one person,
Mhm.
right, will then make the decision based on that information. And then we learn through a feedback loop around
Mhm.
this.
Amazing.
And from there, I think we do a much better job of allowing for what is the learning that we're going to do here.
Mhm.
Like I would say for any new project, if your goals are to like make like a bunch of ARR in your goals,
Mhm.
you're not really understanding where you are in this process. And I think Kent Beck talks about this on like an S curve. When you're down in this like explore area right here, it's how many experiments can you do as fast and cheap as possible to learn.
Mhm.
And if you're over concerned with actually being somewhere in the rocket ship part of that experience, you're going to optimize for the wrong things, which in this case is learning as much as you can versus fixing all the problems you find. And those are two very different ways to think
I
about the
agree.
world,
I
right?
agree. Perfect. And how do you handle situations where team members are resistant to embracing uncertainty?
Yeah. I mean, there are just some people that are better at uncertainty. And also, I mean, I would say there's domain specific uncertainty for people. Like, I am not very good about calendar uncertainty. I
Mhm.
like to have a calendar that is well set.
Yeah.
However, other people are totally fine with that. So I think this is maybe the importance of the diversity of our teams, is that we need people that are pulling in different directions to really build something that's great. For the people that have a harder time dealing with uncertainty, I would say that there's certain roles that probably deal with it less on average. Like I would say salespeople, it's more about either they signed the deal or they didn't, right? For engineers, it's a lot about this line of code either exists somewhere on a server or in an app or it doesn't. Versus the idea of like product management, business development, I would say certain types of generative user research.
Mhm.
I found that they tend to be okay with the fact that there's just, we don't know everything, and that's
Mhm.
okay, right? So I guess what I would say is that we want to make space for both people, but the fact is that neither one of them is right.
Right.
And so I guess I would just really push hard into saying that like it is totally fine that someone is not okay with uncertainty, but we
Right.
will have to figure out is what is the certainty they need to be able to do their job,
Mhm.
right? And this gets the fact that like, if even like someone, one of the key problems is usually how far in advance should we commit to a date so that, say, marketing can then get all of their ducks in a row to be able to like do a big marketing messaging. And there are ways to deal with that where we just don't release the software right away when we're ready for it, right? We make sure it's at the state that marketing should do a big push if we feel like we can't do that. Otherwise, we get into places where there's like a really hard push to get a data in, which then makes people make a lot of trade-offs that are maybe not good for that experience.
Right.
So that's what I'd say is like, it's how do we balance this certainty, uncertainty thing is really what's most important, right? That's why I say, if we can push the decision to the last responsible moment, right? Responsible is the key word here. And there's a whole book about kind of this idea of, I guess, treating decisions as options in some way. And so I think that was like an amazing kind of rethinking of that. We're always optioning future information in some way. We're making bets like that. I think that is how we try to figure this out, is like, what's the worthwhile certainty to create out of this uncertainty so that we can get the job done in some way.
Well said. Chris, I have time for 2 more questions. My next question is, what are some practical techniques to introduce randomization in a team without causing any chaos?
Well, I think having one person be so I think one person actually being the random oracle, but not necessarily telling other people that they are doing that. So I think asking, these different questions, or having doing ideation through certain types of like tools like ChatGPT and Claude and stuff like that. I think if you do that, ideally you're trying to make your questions better to the team, right? And so that's one thing I would say. Now, there's a hazard here, which is kind of like in the world of red teaming, which is a lot about this idea of being an adversarial person inside a team. It can be career limiting to be that adversarial person.
Correct.
Like, it's hard for you to be seen as something else. So I guess it's like, I would like to make the case that everybody should be using these tools to be able to make their teams better at decision making. Sometimes it means individuals in that team have to harness the burden of understanding the randomness or using randomness. But I found that in a lot of different ways, like even just the idea of like using randomness in a workshop format, people are usually pretty open to things. I think the times that they're not is when they end up being, I guess, very reactive, where they feel like they don't have a lot of time. Unfortunately, those types of teams, it's much harder for them to think about kind of how do we make a decision around this. They just want to make a decision. Or how do we include more variance in our ideas here? It's like, we can't do that. We have to just get this done.
Right.
And so that's where I think we start seeing this kind of vicious circle that starts to happen for teams, is that they're not willing to consider something other than what is kind of the thing that's right in front of them. And I think that hurts teams an awful lot too. So yeah, that's what I'd say is, like, I think in those cases, you almost have to be like a secret randomizer inside of that team.
Well said. Well said. Great response. And my last question for you, what advice or what lessons would you have for leaders who are trying to build a culture that embraces uncertainty and randomness?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing I would tell them is that by the fact that you're a leader inside, with a position of power inside of an organization, it means that you will naturally try to reduce the variance of that organization based on what you've seen to be successful at your previous roles.
Correct.
And the problem with that is that it's very hard to know when you're doing that versus something else. And so what I would say is that you should try to get into like the mode of getting unsolicited feedback from your team. You should find someone that is on your team that is good at disagreeing with you, and have them disagree with you in public.
Yeah.
And you should accept the way they disagree. You should accept the way they ask questions. Because what you want to build that case for them and everybody else to be able to like actually have real discussions with you.
Right.
Because as you get higher up in the organization, it gets harder and harder to get real feedback. The second thing is find someone that is actually communicating with your team on a regular basis that can side channel you feedback. And so one of the roles that I would play a lot of the times, even though I was an IC reporting to like a VP or something like that, would be running the team retros for their director, for their direct reports. Or right now I'm actually going through the second listening tour that I've done inside of GitHub, where I'm interviewing like 20-something PMs to understand how they experience their life as a product manager at GitHub. And so that ends up becoming incredibly valuable, because if we can in some way get the leaders to change the way they think about things, that is actually the hardest job of all.
Correct.
It's not getting people to comply to new process or things like that, or getting the individual contributors to think of something differently. It's to get the leaders to think of something differently. So I think that's the second thing, is trying to find those people that are kind of like, not just necessarily canaries, but like in the mind, but like the people that can actually tell you where the canaries are in the mind. And then the final thing I would say is allowing for more open spaces where it's more participatory by nature. Because I think a lot of the times we end up doing a lot of top-down types of process or strategy or things like that. We should be building the ability for participatory bottoms-up type of things to merge in more. I would just say, like, bottoms up does not mean here's the strategy, now give me a bunch of ideas. It means it means something more from the standpoint of there's a push and pull between. The top down means that it's people are providing context from a broader place than other people could find because they're higher up in the organization. They may have better understanding about things. It doesn't mean they're more strategic. They just have different information. And then the people that are at the bottoms up, they're actually providing nuance and like special cases.
Amazing.
And so I just think that those things are really, really important.
Very well said. And on that note, Chris, and your amazing lessons, figure out a way to get unsolicited feedback. Find people who can communicate your thoughts to your teams in a manner that is more acceptable. And third one you said was allow for open spaces where people can actually give recommendation bottoms up rather than being driven by bosses who may want to hear what their thoughts are. Thank you for speaking to me at such length about your own journey. You seem to have worked with all the top organizations in the world. We covered some very interesting topics on bias, uncertainty, and randomization. We spoke about some of the common biases. We spoke about empathy mapping. We spoke about the challenges of ambiguity. We also talked about several other factors, but what was very interesting was how you handle the whole topic of randomization in a team without causing chaos. Thank you again for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.